When I try to remember the first time I noticed that other people wore different things than I did, I am not really remembering a moment at all, but more of an atmosphere, the way a room feels when something is being said without being said. I was probably 8 or 9. The house we lived in then had a small laundry closet with a sliding door that never quite closed all the way, and on Saturdays the basket would sit on the floor full of whatever my parents had worn during the week. I am fairly certain I did not think much about it the first several times I walked past it. Children are not usually thinking about laundry in any philosophical way. They're mostly thinking about whether there will be cookies later or whether it is going to rain. But somewhere in that stretch of small Saturdays, something started to lodge in me, and I did not have a name for it then, and I am still not entirely sure it deserves a name now, only an honest retelling. I remember clear as anything the moment I reached into the basket and pulled out a piece of my mother's clothing. I think it was a slip, the old-fashioned kind that people do not really wear much anymore, something pale peach-colored with a small lace trim along the edge. I held it in both hands. I did not know what it was called in those exact terms. I knew it was something that was hers, that it was soft, that it was for her body and not for mine, and that there was a quiet boundary around it the same way there was a quiet boundary around the medicine cabinet and the bills on the kitchen counter and the bedroom door when it was pulled shut. I knew I was supposed to leave it alone. I touched it anyway. That is the honest part of this that I cannot rewrite. I want to say here, before I go any further, that I do not think I did anything a court would punish. I want to say that because I have spent a long time being afraid of the way this story sounds if you only hear the first 2 minutes of it. There was no harm done to anyone. There was no molestation, no abuse, no force of any kind. There was a child in a hallway with a piece of fabric and a private curiosity, and a household that was in many ways too distracted to notice. I will return to this line again later because it matters, but for now I want to honor the version of me who is just there in the hallway, trying to understand what made some things feel different from other things. The fact that I am writing about it 30 years later does not retroactively make the moment more than it was. Some readers will assume the worst. I am asking you to do the harder thing and not assume. I carried the slip back to my room, and I held it against my chest. That is the part that is uncomfortable for people who are not there. I did not understand why I wanted to do it. It was not arousal in any adult sense, because I did not have an adult sense. It was more like the feeling you get when you put on a coat that belongs to someone you love and feel the shape of them in the shoulders. There was comfort in it. There was a strange closeness to my mother that I could not have asked for any other way because my mother was a person who worked 2 jobs and came home tired and did not always have the extra bandwidth to sit with me. So I was sitting with her, in a way, by holding the slip. At least that is how I have come to interpret it. I might be wrong. The next part of this story is the part people usually skip over because it is the part that does not move forward. It just sits there. I did not know what to do with the slip, so I folded it up and put it in the back of my dresser under a stack of t-shirts I never wore. I did not take it out again that week or the next. When I did take it out weeks later, I put it on over my clothes and stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself. This is going to sound like something it is not. I was not pretending to be a woman. I was not pretending to be anyone. I was looking at the shape of the fabric against my small body and trying to figure out who I was. I think now that is what children do when they are given something they do not have language for. They try it on. I do not remember the world ending after that. I do not remember being caught. I do not remember being punished. What I remember is that nothing happened, and that nothing is the thing that taught me most of all. Because nothing happened, I learned that this was something you could do as long as no one saw you. That lesson grew up alongside me and became the most expensive lesson I would ever receive. I learned that I could have a private self, and that the private self could be anything I needed it to be, and that as long as I kept it outside of sight, it did not have to trouble anyone. What I did not learn until decades later was that the private self does not actually stay outside of sight. It shows up in the room when you are 42 years old, and you cannot figure out why you are unhappy. I want to pause here and say something plain. A lot of the stories you find about this topic are written for an audience that wants to be entertained. They have titles that promise something shocking, and they deliver something that is, in fact, only slightly more shocking than a person buying a new shirt at the department store. I am not writing for that audience. If you came to this story looking for titillation, you are in the wrong place, and I would rather you leave now than feel like I tricked you into staying. You can stop reading. I will not be offended. What I want to talk about is the ordinary interior life of a person who discovered that the categories he was given did not quite fit, and the long work of trying to live honestly inside that discovery without hurting anyone, and without hurting himself. Let me tell you about my family, because without them the rest of this does not make sense. My mother is still alive. She is in her 70s. She reads and gardens and calls me on Sundays. I talk to her about most of my life openly now, and we have built a careful, honest relationship that took years of repair. My father died when I was 19, and I will come back to that too. I had one older sister who moved away and started her own family early and was always the sensible one in the eyes of everyone who met her. We were a working-class family in a Midwestern town that is small enough that I do not need to name it. We went to church almost every Sunday. We said please and thank you, and we did not talk about bodies. We did not talk about feelings unless the feelings had a clear script attached to them. What I want you to understand is that I did not grow up in a household that was openly hostile. There was no yelling about what was right and wrong most of the time. There was just a quiet sense of having a shape, of the family being a shape, and of certain things having a place inside that shape, and certain things not having a place. Lingerie did not have a place. Curiosity about your mother's unto things did not have a place. The interior life of a 9-year-old boy, if it wandered into territory that was not boy territory, did not have a place. I learned the shape of the family the same way a mouse learns the shape of a maze, by bumping against the walls. The walls were not cruel. They were just there. My mother, who I love, was never unkind about this kind of thing in any way I could point to. She was the kind of tired that meant she did not have the bandwidth to police the edges of every room. If she had known what was happening in my dresser drawer, I think she would have sat me down and explained some things and probably bought me a book. But she did not know. And I did not tell her. And the silence compounded, week after week, until the silence itself became one of the most important relationships in my childhood. The silence was where I kept the things I was not allowed to put anywhere else. I am going to say this next part slowly, because I think it is the single most important thing I have to share in this entire telling. Curiosity about clothing, about the way different clothes feel on different bodies, about the way fabric carries the shape of the person who wore it, is not by itself a problem. There is nothing wrong with noticing. There is nothing wrong with holding a piece of your mother's slip when you are a child who is trying to understand the people who live in the same house as you. The problem starts when nobody talks about it. The problem starts when the child decides that the curiosity is a secret and carries the secret alone.
That is what happened to me.
By the time I was 12, the secret weighed more than I could carry, and by the time I was 16, I was better at hiding it than at anything else in my life, and by the time I was 20, I had built an entire adult self around the skill of not being seen. I want to say one more thing about my mother before I move the story forward, because the title of this video is the title for a reason. She did say, on more than one occasion, that she wanted me to wear her things. The moment I am thinking of happened when I was maybe 11 or 12. She had lost a lot of weight after an illness, and she had a bag of clothes she was getting rid of, and she made a joke that I do not remember exactly, but that I understood to mean something like, if you ever want any of these for when you are older and skinnier, the offer stands. It was a throwaway comment. It was said in passing. I am sure she does not remember saying it. To me, it was permission and threat at the same time, the way a lot of parental comments are when you are a child. Permission because it told me I was not crazy for having thought about it. Threat because it told me that if I ever did anything about it, she would remember having said it, and the memory would be on her side of the conversation. I did not take her up on the offer that night. I did not take her up on the offer for many years. But the offer changed the secret into something that had a paper trail, even if the paper was a single sentence passed across a kitchen table, and once a secret has a paper trail, it is no longer entirely yours to keep. Let me move forward now. I am going to skip the years that are too ordinary to retell, the school years, the friend years, the basketball and the reading and the bad haircuts and the last days of summer that all look the same in memory. I will pick the story back up around 14, when things in my interior life started to be a little more serious than a child with a slip in his dresser drawer. At 14, I had stopped being a child in any practical sense. My body had started doing things I could not control and that nobody at home wanted to discuss, and the school hallways had started doing things too, becoming spaces where other boys were suddenly louder and larger and more interested in being watched than I had ever wanted to be. I had two close friends in those years, both of them quiet. We played video games and read science fiction, and sometimes sat on one of our porches until it got dark talking about whether we believed in God. I told them almost nothing about what was happening on the inside, because what was happening on the inside had no clear shape, and I did not want to give it one by speaking. What had changed was that the impulse had grown up. The slip from 10 years earlier had been replaced by a more abstract thing, not a single piece of fabric, but a category of private behavior. I would wait until everyone else in the house was asleep. I would close my bedroom door. I would take out a piece of clothing, almost always something of my mother's, and I would put it on, and I would stand in front of the bathroom mirror in the dark with a small reading lamp angled, so that I could see my face but not the rest of me. I did not do this every night. I did it on nights when something at school had made me feel too obvious. I did it on nights when I had not been picked for the team. I did it on nights when a teacher had said my name in a tone that I still cannot hear without flinching. The clothing did something to me that I could not have explained then. It made me invisible to myself for a few minutes, which was the only invisibility available to me. I want to use the word honestly here. I am 46 years old. I have been to therapy. I have read the relevant books. I have talked about this with a partner who loved me and with a friend who is a clinician and with my mother late in her life in a long phone call that I will tell you about. The honest answer to what the clothing did for me when I was 14 is that it quieted a part of me that was being shouted at all day. I was a quiet kid among louder kids, and quiet kids are not safe. Quiet kids are the ones who get sat next to in class by the bullies because the bullies know the quiet kids will not report them. Quiet kids are the ones who get teased in the locker room and who smile and pretend not to hear it. Quiet kids are the ones who go home and lie on their bed and stare at the ceiling and wonder what is wrong with them. The clothing did not fix what was wrong. It gave me a place to put the wrongness down for a few minutes, the way you might set down a heavy bag at the top of a staircase. There is a vocabulary that some readers will expect me to have, and I have thought long and hard about whether to use it. There are words like gender dysphoria, and gender nonconforming, and transgender, and cross-streaming, and on and on. Each of those words is useful for some people, and not useful for others. I tried several of them on at different points in my life, and none of them fit me exactly, and I want to honor that not fitting instead of pretending I figured it out. I am a person whose relationship to clothing and to the question of which clothes belong on which body has been more complicated than the categories I was given. That is a sentence I can stand behind. I cannot stand behind a more specific one without lying about something, and I am tired of lying. Let me talk about what my father did and did not know, because it bears on the rest of this in ways I did not understand while he was alive. My father was a kind man in most of the ways that show up in obituaries. He coached Little League. He showed up to school plays. He taught me how to change the oil in a car. He was also, in the way that a lot of men of his generation were, emotionally absent in ways that he probably did not have the tools to address. He worked construction and his back hurt most of the time, and he watched the news after dinner, and he went to bed. If he had known about the slip, or the dresses, or any of the things I am telling you about, I believe he would have done something violent. Not because he was a violent person, but because he did not have a category for it. He would have needed to act, and acting for him would have meant yelling and grabbing and possibly hitting. I am not saying this to punish him from the dead. I am saying this to explain why I made sure he never knew. My mother, I think, suspected, on some level. I think mothers often suspect more than we credit them for, and we should not assume that not knowing is the same as not seeing. There was a moment when I was 16 when she came into my room to put away laundry, and I had left a piece of lingerie in an obvious place on the bed, because I had been careless that day, because I had been distracted, because the secret had started to feel less like a private thing, and more like a thing that wanted to be discovered by someone who would not punish me.
She saw it.
She did not say anything. She put the laundry down on the bed, picked up the piece of lingerie, looked at it for what felt like a very long time, and then put it back exactly where it had been. She left the room. She did not come back that night. The next morning she said nothing about it. For the next several weeks, she said nothing about it. I want to dwell on this moment because I think it is one of the most important moments in the entire story, and because the wrong interpretation of it would be easy to land on. The wrong interpretation is that my mother knew and chose to ignore because she was afraid. That is partially true, but it is not the whole of it. The whole of it is that my mother saw her son doing a private thing that the world would not understand, and she made a decision, that night, and in the days after it, to protect me from the version of herself that did not know how to talk about it. She chose, in her own limited way, not to make my secret into a crisis. That is a kind of love, even if it is the imperfect kind that comes from people who do not have the right words. I have come to love my mother for that moment in a way that is hard to describe and that I will return to. She did eventually, years later, sit me down and talk about it. She did not use the words I would have used. She used the words she had. She said something like, "I have known for a long time that you have a part of yourself that you keep in a separate room. I want you to know that I see the room, and I do not hate you for having it, and I wish I had been a stronger parent so that you could have left the door open." I cried in a way that surprised me. I am not a person who cries easily, and I cried in a way that surprised me because it was not the kind of crying I had been doing for 30 years, the slow grief kind that happens behind closed doors. It was the kind of crying that happens when somebody has been carrying a thing alone, and another person finally picks up half of it. I want to keep moving, but I want to underline that moment because it is in the room with us for the rest of this story. My mother saw me. She did not save me. She could not have saved me.
But she saw me.
There is a difference between being seen and being saved. This story is about being seen. I went to college not far from home because I was tired of small towns and not brave enough to go far. I picked a state school where nobody knew me and where the dorm rooms were small enough to be unexamined. I joined a club or two. I dated a little. I made friends who knew only the public version of me, which was a person who liked to play ping pong and to argue about movies and who sometimes said something funny in a way that made people trust him quickly. I was good at being good at things. The problem was that what I was good at was a single performance, and I had been running the same performance since I was about 12, and the longer I ran it, the more tired I got doing it. The performance was not sustainable, but I did not know what would replace it, so I kept running it. Sex happened in college, of course. Sex was not what you might think it was. Given what I have been telling you, I want to handle this with the same care that I have tried to handle everything else. Sex with the women I dated in college was tender and awkward and a little disconnected in the way most early sex is, and it did not involve any of the private behavior I have been describing. The private behavior was, and remains, something I experienced and continue to experience as a solo interior practice. It is not, for me, something that involves another person's body. I want to say this clearly because the popular imagination about people like me runs in directions that are wrong and that hurt everyone, including the people whose imaginations are running in those directions. Whatever you may have read elsewhere about this topic, please let it be plain that the version of me I am describing involved no other human being in any way that they did not choose and chose freely and felt respected in. What sex did do for me was complicate the secret further. I had partners I loved. I had partners I was dishonest with. I had at least one partner who I told in a conversation I remember word for word and whose response I want to share because I think it teaches something important. She was a woman named Kara, who I dated for a little over a year. I told her in a Starbucks on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of a semester. I told her in the simplest language I could find. I told her that there was a private practice I had that involved clothing, that it was not about her, that I wanted her to know because I did not want to lie to her, that I did not know what the practice meant, that I was working on figuring it out. She listened. She drank her coffee. She asked me 2 questions. The first question was some version of, "Are you safe?" The second question was some version of, "Do you want help?" I said yes to the first and no to the second. She went on being my girlfriend for several more months, during which time we talked about it twice more, and during which time she never once made me feel like I was a different person than the one she had been dating. We broke up for reasons that had nothing to do with the story. She is still a person I think of when I think about how to treat other people when they tell you a thing about themselves that you did not expect. She treated me like I had just told her something true. That is what people deserve when they tell you something true. I want to briefly circle back to my father before I move the story into adulthood because he died when I was 19 and his death rearranged things in ways I am still working out. He died in a car accident on a Tuesday afternoon in November. I was at a friend's apartment when I got the call. I drove home in the dark without turning on the radio. When I got there, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table with the phone in her hand and her shoes still on. She looked at me and she said, "He is gone." That is the sentence that I have carried around with me since then. He is gone. 2 words. 3 syllables. The entire rest of my life has been shaped by the echo of those 3 syllables in that kitchen. The thing I want to say about my father's death, in the context of this story, is that it did not free me. It is a thing people sometimes assume when they read about parents who are not emotionally available, that the parent's death is a kind of release. It is not, and it was not. My father's death was a loss in the raw and unprocessed sense, and it was also a loss in the sense that I lost the chance to ever tell him what I am telling you now. I will never sit across from him at his kitchen table and explain myself to him. That conversation is permanently impossible, and its impossibility has colored my relationship with honesty ever since. I think sometimes that the hardest truth I have had to learn is that some of the people who needed to know things about me are not available to know them, and that is just a part of life, and that no amount of wishing will make it otherwise. I will tell you one more thing about my father because it has been a long time since I have told anyone. There is a single photograph of him in a suit that I keep in a drawer in my office.
He looks serious in it. He was serious in it.
He is the only person I have ever known who could look serious in a photograph that was taken at a wedding. My mother gave me the photograph the year after he died, and I have carried it with me through every move I have ever made. I have never shown it to a partner. I have never shown it to a friend. I keep it because I want to look at his face sometimes, and I want to remember that he was here, and I want to be the kind of son who keeps a photograph of his father in a drawer and who does not lose track of where it is. I did not know what to do with the private practice after my father died. There was a stretch of a few months where it stopped entirely, which was, in retrospect, a strain on me in ways that I did not recognize. I want to be careful about this because I do not want to suggest that the practice was an addiction or a compulsion. It was a comfort, and comforts are hard to remove from a life without leaving a hole. When I removed it, the hole showed up in other places. I drank more than I should have. I lost some weight that I could not afford to lose. I went to a doctor for the first time in years and got checked for the kinds of things a 20-year-old goes to a doctor for, and the doctor told me that my blood pressure was too high and that I needed to sleep more. I did not tell the doctor about the practice. I should have told the doctor about the practice. Most of what was wrong with me in those months would have been easier to fix if I had told the doctor about the practice. I want to stop and say something important here because it bears on the kind of content I want this to be. The story you're reading is not a how-to. I am not going to give you tips. I am not going to describe techniques. I am going to describe a person who is confused, who acted on the confusion in private ways that did not harm anyone, who carried the confusion into adulthood, who lied about it, who got tired of lying about it, who talked about it, who tried to stop talking about it, who talked about it again, who finally made peace with the conversation, and who is now telling you about it in the hope that telling you will help someone else who is in the hallway with a piece of fabric and does not know what to do about it. If you want a how-to, you can leave. If you want a long, slow, honest account, please stay. I met the woman who became my wife when I was 23. We met at a job I held for about a year and a half, working the front desk at a gym while I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my degree, which was an English degree that I had not used yet. Her name was Lorraine, and she is still alive, and we are still friends, and she is one of the better people I have ever known. I told her about the private practice about 6 months into the relationship in a conversation we had in her apartment on a Sunday morning while we were making eggs. I told her the same things I had told Kara, more or less, and she took it about the same way. She asked me a couple of gentle questions. She told me that she loved me and that nothing I had told her changed that. She told me that she wanted me to be honest with her about it and that she would always be honest with me about how she felt about it. Lorraine and I were together for 11 years, and we were married for 6 of them. We split up in our late 30s, and we are still friends. We split up for reasons that were real and that had some relationship to honesty, but that did not have the relationship to honesty that you might assume. We split up because we changed in different directions and because we did not have the tools to make the changes into something we could do together. We split up because the private practice, which she had tolerated for years, eventually started to take up more space than she was comfortable with, not because it got bigger in any dramatic way, but because I started in our later years together to bring it more into the open, and she was not sure she was the right person to be married to a person who was bringing it more into the open. I do not blame her for that. I consider it one of the most generous things she ever did, leaving me, because it made me responsible for myself in a way that I would not have been responsible if she had stayed. I went to therapy, finally, when I was 38. I had put it off for a long time, because I had thought I could figure it out on my own, and because I did not want to pay somebody to look at me, and because I was afraid that a therapist would tell me I was something I did not want to be called. I went to a woman who had been recommended by a friend, in an office in a professional building 3 blocks from where I lived, and I sat in her waiting room and tried not to look at the other patients, and then went into her office and sat in a chair that was more comfortable than I expected and started talking. I want to tell you about my therapy because I think it is the part of this story that most people who tell this story skip, and I think it is the part most worth telling. I saw this therapist for almost 2 years. In the first few months, I did not tell her about the practice. I told her about my father. I told her about my mother. I told her about being a quiet kid in a louder world. I told her about my drinking. I told her about my marriage. We worked on these things, and the working on them changed my life in measurable ways. I slept better. I was less angry. I had more patience with my coworkers. I was nicer to my mother on the phone. I was present with my friends in a way that I had not been before. None of those things are small. When I finally told her about the practice, I was in our 9th or 10th session. I told her in the same simple language I had used with Cara and Lorraine.
She did not blink.
She said something like, "Thank you for telling me." She asked me a couple of questions that were similar to the ones Cara had asked. Are you safe? Do you want help? She then asked me a third question that I had not been asked before, which was some version of, what does it give you? I want to share with you what I told her, because I think it is the most honest thing I have ever said to another human being about this, and I have only said it aloud to a few people. I told her that what it gave me was a room. I told her that I had spent my whole life as a person who had rooms inside of me that other people could not see, and that the clothing and the act of putting it on, and the feeling of being dressed in something that was not for me, was a way of being in one of those rooms. I told her that the room had a particular feeling, which was the feeling of being held without being touched, and that the feeling was not about any other person, and that the feeling was about me mostly and the way I experienced my own body. I told her that the room was not always a happy room, and that it was sometimes a room I was in, because the rest of the rooms were too loud. I told her that I wanted to be able to live without needing the room so much, and that I wanted to be able to be in the room without shame, and that I thought those two things were different projects. My therapist said something I carry with me now. She said that the projects were different, but that they were not in conflict. She said that being in the room without shame was necessary in order to live without needing the room so much. She said that shame was the thing that was turning the room from a private comfort into a private prison. I have never had a sentence explained to me that did so much in so few words. The room had become a prison because I was ashamed of needing it. As long as I was ashamed of needing it, I would need it more. As long as I needed it more, I would be more ashamed. The two were spiraling around each other, and shame was the friction that kept them going. We worked on the shame. We worked on the shame in ways that did not require me to decide what the practice meant. We worked on the shame by talking about all the other rooms I had been ashamed of as well. We worked on the shame of being a quiet kid. We worked on the shame of not being picked for the team. We worked on the shame of having a father who could not see me. We worked on the shame of having a mother who could see me but could not, at first, say so. We worked on the shame of being the kind of man who had private rooms. The shame, it turns out, was the same shame in all those places. It was the shame of being the kind of person who feels more than the categories allow for, and of having to pretend, day after day, that the feelings are not there. Therapy did not end the practice.
I want to be honest about that.
I am not sure therapy will ever end the practice, and I have made my peace with that. What therapy did was change the practice from something I had to do into something I could choose to do. That distinction is the most important distinction I have ever learned. There is a difference between a thing you must do because the alternative is unbearable and a thing you choose to do because you have decided that it is part of who you are. Once the practice became something I could choose, the urgency fell away. I was no longer running to the room. I was visiting it. I am 46 years old, and to the best of my knowledge, no one outside my close circle knows that I have ever had this practice. I work in a profession where that privacy matters. I have neighbors who would not understand. I have colleagues who would gossip. I have a sister who I love and who would probably understand, but who I have decided, after long consideration, not to tell, because she has children who are still young, and because the timing would never be right. I am not telling you my profession because it does not matter. I am not telling you my location because it does not matter. I am telling you this story without the identifying detail because the identifying detail is not the point of the story. The point of the story is the rooms. I live alone now. I have for the last several years. I live alone by choice and not by circumstance. I live in a small apartment with a lot of books and a lot of plants and one piece of my mother's slip that I have kept for 30 years in a wooden box on the top shelf of my closet. The wooden box is one of the few things I have that belong to my grandmother. I keep the slip in it because the slip is older than I am and because the slip and the box together feel like an honest summary of a complicated life. I do not wear the slip anymore. I do not need to wear the slip anymore. I take it out once every year or two and I hold it for a few minutes and I put it back. That is what visiting the room looks like for me now. It looks like standing in front of my closet with a piece of fabric and remembering who I was when I was 10 and being grateful that I am not that person anymore and being grateful that I am also not a person who is ashamed of having been that person. I started writing this story 3 years ago in a journal in longhand in the morning before work. I started writing it because I had run out of other things to write about. I had written about my father in that journal at length. I had written about my mother. I had written about Lorraine. I had written about Kara. I had written about the gym job and the English degree and the years I had spent in an office I did not love. I had written all of those things because I thought that the practice was something that existed apart from them, and I had organized the journal that way, with the practice in its own section at the back like a tax form. I want to laugh about that now because the journal's organization was itself a kind of shame. As long as the practice was its own section, it was a separate thing, and a separate thing can be removed. I am still writing in that journal, almost every morning. The organization has changed. The practice is no longer in its own section at the back. It is woven into the rest of the writing, the same way my life is woven into the rest of the writing. I write about the practice in the middle of paragraphs about my job, and in between paragraphs about my mother, and sometimes in paragraphs about the weather. This is what integration looks like. Integration is not a project. Integration is the slow disappearance of the need for a special section. Integration is the day you realize that you have not thought of the practice as a separate thing for weeks, and that you have been writing about it next to everything else, and that no part of you has reacted to the writing with shame. I want to talk gently about how I think about this topic in the wider world now. I am not a politician. I am not a pundit. I am a person who has lived in this body and this mind for a long time, and who watches the world talk about people like me in cycles that swing between cruelty and oversimplification. I have a few beliefs about it that I hold loosely and that I want to share because they might help you. The first belief is that every person contains more rooms than the world can see. The visible rooms are the ones with names, the ones our culture has agreed to give names to. The other rooms are the ones we keep for ourselves. The other rooms are not problems. They are not pathologies. They are not fetishes. They are the parts of us that do not have an agreed-on vocabulary yet, and the lack of a vocabulary is not the same as a lack of existence. The second belief is that shame is the most dangerous tool we have for managing the rooms we do not understand. Shame is the tool that says this room is so bad that you must not look at it. Shame is the tool that says this room is so bad that you must not tell anyone about it. Shame is the tool that says this room is so bad that you must pretend it does not exist. Shame is the tool that converts a private comfort into a private prison. Shame is the tool I was most familiar with for most of my life, and shame is the tool I have spent the last several years learning to put down. Putting it down did not mean pretending it was not there. Putting it down meant recognizing that I had been holding it and that I did not have to keep holding it. The third belief is that most of the people who do what I did as children are not doing something monstrous. I have talked online and in person and through letters with hundreds of people who did what I did as children or something similar to it, and almost none of them were doing something monstrous. Almost all of them were doing something that the world had not given them permission to do. Almost all of them were doing something that would have been harmless if somebody had talked to them about it. Almost all of them grew up to be ordinary adults who pay their bills and love their friends and are not, in any statistical sense, more likely to do harm than anyone else. I want to say this carefully because I know there are real cases in which private behaviors cross lines that should not have been crossed, and I do not want to minimize those cases. I want to say only that the cases I have seen in my own life and in the lives of the people I have talked with are mostly the ordinary cases, and that the ordinary cases do not deserve the kind of cultural condemnation that some of them receive. The fourth belief is that honesty is the only durable cure for shame, and that honesty is sometimes expensive. Honesty is expensive because it requires you to give up the version of yourself that other people think they know. Honesty is expensive because some of the people who think they know you will not understand when you tell them the truth. Honesty is expensive because some of the people who think they know you will not stay when you tell them the truth. But honesty is the only durable cure, and the alternatives are more expensive in the long run. The alternatives are decades of pretending. The alternatives are decades of performing. The alternatives are decades of being tired in a way that no one can see. I have a friend named Mark who I told some years ago, in a conversation at a coffee shop, and whose reaction is the most perfect one I have ever received. Mark listened to me. He finished his coffee. He said, "I have known you for 10 years, and I have never known this about you, and you telling me this has not changed a single thing about how I see you, and I want you to know that." I think about Mark almost every day. I think about Mark because his reaction is the kind of reaction I want for every person who tells a truth that nobody was expecting. I want for every person who tells a truth that nobody was expecting to hear some version of what Mark said, which is that the truth, once told, has not changed the person who is hearing it, and that the person who told it is still the same person who was sitting across the table a minute ago, and that the minute after the truth is no different from the minute before the truth in any way that matters. I want to talk for a moment about the relationship between this story and the broader conversation about identity that our culture is having, because I do not want to pretend that this story exists in a vacuum. There are people in the world who are trans, and there are people in the world who are gender nonconforming, and there are people in the world who are crossdressers, and there are people in the world who do not have a single word for what they are. There are children who announce at age 4 what they are, and there are adults who do not figure it out until age 40, and there are some of us who will not figure it out during the lifetimes we have. The cultural conversation about all of this is real, and it is loud, and it is sometimes compassionate, and it is sometimes cruel, and it is, in my opinion, mostly too fast. We are moving faster than the people in the middle of figuring it out can keep up. We are moving faster than the parents can keep up. We are moving faster than the teachers can keep up. We are moving faster than the people who live in small towns with no access to a community of people like themselves can keep up. I do not have a fix for that. I have a wish, which is that the cultural conversation would slow down and that it would make room for the people in the middle, the people who are figuring it out, the people who do not have a word yet, the people who live in the middle of the country, the people who are 50 years old and have only just figured out what they are, the people who are 15 years old and are figuring it out right now, the people who are 35 years old and are not going to figure it out during the lifetimes they have. I have a wish that the cultural conversation would include those people, and I have a fear that it will not, because the cultural conversation is run by people who have already figured it out and who are now advocating for a position, and the advocacy is sometimes so loud that it pushes the people in the middle further inside their rooms. A video like this one is, in its own small way, an attempt to leave a door open for the people in the middle. If you are one of those people, and if you have watched this far, I want you to know that I see you. I want you to know that I have been where you are. I want you to know that the rooms will not eat you alive if you let yourself look at them. I want you to know that shame is not the only tool available for managing the rooms. I want you to know that there is a version of you on the other side of the work, and that the version of you on the other side of the work has more access to his own life than the version of you who is hiding in the rooms. I want you to know that the work is not easy, and that it is not fast, and that it does not always end in a clean conclusion. I want you to know that the work is worth it, in the end, because the alternative is the rest of your life. I want to close with a few words about my mother, who is still alive and who reads these things when I let her, and who calls me on Sundays. My mother, who lost her husband in a car accident in November. My mother, who raised 2 children on her own after the accident and who worked 2 jobs and who came home tired. My mother, who saw her son in a piece of lingerie one night and who chose not to make her crisis out of his private life. My mother, who sat me down in her kitchen late in her life and told me that she saw the room. My mother is the bravest person I have ever known, and she will never know that I have said so in a place where anyone could read it. I hope that she will never know, because the telling would embarrass her, and because the bravery is the kind that embarrasses the person who has it. The bravery of an ordinary person is almost always quiet. The bravery of an ordinary person is, in most cases, the kind that you only recognize after it is over. I want to talk to the parents who might be reading the story or watching the story because I think they're a part of the audience that matters most. Parents, especially parents of children who are quiet, parents of children who seem to be hiding something, parents of children who do not always fit the shape the family has been given. I want to talk to you directly, please, for a few paragraphs, because you are the people who have the most leverage and the least information, and that combination is a dangerous one in any household. I am not an expert. I am one person, but I have been the child in this story, and so I know what the child is feeling in a way that an expert cannot, no matter how good the expert is. The child is feeling 2 things at once, almost always. The child is feeling the private thing, which is whatever the private thing is for that particular child. And the child is feeling the fear, which is the fear that the private thing will be discovered, and that the discovery will be met with a reaction that the child cannot survive. The fear is usually bigger than the private thing. The fear is the part of the equation that does most of the damage. If you are a parent and you suspect that your child has a private thing that they are carrying, I want to offer a few thoughts, gently, knowing that I am speaking into a situation I cannot see and cannot possibly understand in its full complexity. The first thought is that discovering the private thing is not the same as confronting the child about it. Discovery is one thing and confrontation is another. Confrontation almost always makes the situation worse. Confrontation is what a parent does when they are afraid of the private thing. Discovery is what a parent does when they are curious about the private thing. If you can stand in front of what you have found and feel curiosity instead of fear, you will handle the discovery well. If you feel fear, you should probably get help for the fear before you do anything about the discovery. The second thought is that the vast majority of what children do in private is not what the most panicked version of the imagination says it is. There are real cases in which private behaviors are problematic, and those cases need to be addressed, and they should be addressed by professionals. But the most common version of this story is the version in which the child is doing a private thing that is not dangerous, that is not predatory, that is not violent, that is not anything that would cause any other person any harm at all. The most common version is the version in which the child is doing a private thing that the child cannot talk about because nobody has made the talking possible. The third thought is that the talking is not a single conversation. The talking is a process. The process might take years. The process might take a dozen conversations. The process will test your patience in ways that you did not know your patience could be tested. The process is worth the testing because the alternative is that the child grows up to be an adult who has never been able to talk about the private thing with anyone, and that adult will carry it alone, and that aloneness will shape every relationship they ever have. I want to say one more thing to the parents before I move on. The parents who do this work well are not the parents who give the right answers. The parents who do this work well are the parents who are willing to keep showing up without knowing the right answer. The parents who do this work well are the parents who can sit with their child in the middle of a conversation that neither of them knows how to finish, and who can be honest about not knowing how to finish it, and who can come back tomorrow and try again. That kind of parenting is rare, and it is hard, and it does not require you to be the kind of parent you read about in magazines. It requires you to be the kind of parent who is willing to be uncertain in front of your child, and most parents are not, and the parents who are change lives. I want to talk to the adults in the middle of figuring it out, and I want to do it in a way that does not condescend, because I do not think it is possible to talk about this from a position of having figured it out, and I want to be honest about that. I am a person who is still figuring it out. I am a person who will probably be figuring it out for the rest of my life. The figuring it out is not failure. The figuring it out is the work. I have come to think of it as a practice, in the same way that some people think of prayer as a practice, because the work is never finished, and the value of the work is in the doing of it, not in the reaching of any particular conclusion. If you are an adult in the middle of figuring it out, I want you to know that the figuring it out is more important than any conclusion you might be chasing. I want you to know that the people you respect the most on the topic are usually the ones who are still figuring it out, not the ones who have arrived at a final answer. I want you to know that you do not need to land on a word. You do not need to land on a label. You do not need to land on a public identity that you can use to explain yourself to strangers. You can land on a private understanding that you hold for yourself and that nobody else needs to know about, and you can have a private understanding for as long as you need to have one, and you can change the understanding when you need to change it, and you do not owe anyone a more public version of it than that. I want to encourage you, gently, to consider the people in your life who might be able to hold some of this for you while you are carrying it alone. I am not going to tell you who those people are because you already know. You already know who in your life would not flinch if you told them the truth. You already know who would listen without telling you what the truth means. You already know who would not feel the need to explain you to themselves in order to keep liking you. Those are the people you might want to consider telling when you are ready, in whatever way you are ready, with whatever words you have available. The people we are talking about are not always the people who love us the most. They are the people who can hold complexity without breaking. I want to talk about the loneliness because the loneliness is something I want to address directly and not just imply. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with this kind of private life, and it is not the same as the loneliness of being single or the loneliness of being away from home. It is the loneliness of being in a room full of people who do not know you. It is the loneliness of being at a dinner party where everyone is talking about the things they are and the things they are not, and you are sitting there with a piece of yourself that does not fit any of the categories being discussed. It is the loneliness of watching television and seeing only two kinds of people being talked about, and knowing that you are neither of them, and not having any representation of what you are, and not having anyone to ask whether the absence bothers anyone else. The loneliness is real. The loneliness deserves to be named. The loneliness is one of the things that the people in the middle need most to have acknowledged, even if nothing else can be done about it. Being told that the loneliness is real by someone who understands it is one of the most healing things that can happen to a person in this position. I found the loneliness dissolve for me in ways that were not dramatic. The loneliness dissolved for me when I read a memoir written by a person who did not have a word for what they were. The loneliness dissolved for me when I followed a small online community of people who were keeping their own private rooms and writing about it in public forums that nobody else read. The loneliness dissolved for me when I sat across the table from someone I trusted and said a single sentence about my own interior life and watched their face stay the same. The loneliness dissolved for me in a paper letter that I received from a person I had never met, who had found my writing by accident and who wanted to tell me that they had been carrying a similar thing alone for 40 years. That letter is pinned to the corkboard in my kitchen. I have read it many times. I do not know if the person who wrote it is still alive. The letter is still the most important piece of mail I have ever received, because it was the first time I understood that I was not the only one who had been in the hallway with the piece of fabric. If you are in the middle and you are lonely, please understand that the loneliness is not new. There have been people in this position for as long as there have been clothes, and as long as there have been households, and as long as there have been categories that did not quite fit. The loneliness is not new. The loneliness is just new to you. The loneliness is one of many things that the people who came before us carried as well, and the only thing that has changed is that there is a slight increase in the chance of finding someone else who is carrying it, because there are more ways to find each other now. You are not alone. You are not the first. You are part of a long chain of people who found their way through this, and the chain goes back further than you can see, and the chain will go forward further than you can see, and you are in the chain, and the chain is holding you. I want to say a few more words about therapy because I think it is worth saying more than once, and I think it is worth saying in different ways. I went to therapy for 2 years. I went to therapy with a woman who I trusted and who listened to me and who asked me questions that I had not asked myself. I went to therapy and I got better at sleeping and at being angry in smaller amounts and at being patient with my friends and at being present with my mother on the phone. I went to therapy, and I was able, eventually, to talk about the private practice in a room with another person for the first time in my life. I went to therapy, and I cried about my father in a way that I had not been able to cry about him in for 20 years. I went to therapy and I learned, slowly, that the privacy was not the problem and the embarrassment was not the problem. The problem was the secrecy. The problem was the years I had spent pretending that the private rooms did not exist. The problem was the version of myself I had built up around the pretense. The problem was the aloneness that the pretense required. I want to say one more thing about therapy, because it is something I did not know until I went, and I think it is worth knowing. Therapy is not a place you go to get a diagnosis. Therapy is a place you go to get a witness. The therapist is a witness. The therapist's job is to see the parts of you that you have not let anyone else see, and to see them without flinching, and to see them without telling you what they mean, and to see them in front of you, so that you can practice what it feels like to have them seen. The therapist does not have to know what the parts mean. The therapist does not have to share your categories or your vocabulary or your understanding of what you are. The therapist has to see you. The therapist has to see you without flinching. The therapist has to see you without flinching for long enough that you can start to see yourself without flinching too.
That is what happened to me.
My therapist did not have a category for me. She did not try to give me one. She did not need to give me one. What she gave me was her steady, unflinching attention, week after week, and that steady attention was the medicine. The medicine was not insight. The medicine was not a vocabulary. The medicine was not a theory or a framework or a label. The medicine was a person in a chair, looking at me, week after week, who did not flinch. I want to recommend therapy to anyone who is in a position like mine, and I want to recommend it without promise that the therapy will give you a conclusion. The therapy will give you a witness. The witness is what you need. The witness is what most of us carry alone for years, and the witness is what heals the aloneness, and the aloneness is what usually does most of the damage. I want to tell you about one specific session because it captures something about the therapy that changed my life in a way I did not expect. We were about a year into our work together. I had been talking about the private practice for several sessions in a row, in language that was getting more honest each time. In the middle of one session, after I had been talking about it for maybe 10 minutes, my therapist stopped me and asked me a question that I had not been asked before, and that I am almost afraid to write down here, because it changed something in me that I have not been able to undo. The question was some version of this. If you woke up tomorrow and the private practice had never existed, and you had never had the impulse, and you had never even had the curiosity, what would be missing in your life? I want to tell you what I said because what I said surprised me, and because what I said was, I think, closer to the truth of the thing than anything I have said before or since. I told her that what would be missing would be the capacity to be alone in a way that did not feel lonely. I told her that what would be missing would be the capacity to enter a private space and to feel, in the private space, like a person I could stand to be. I told her that what would be missing would be the part of me that had learned, by practicing the practice, how to be a person who had rooms. I told her that the practice had taught me something important about solitude, and that the something important was not about clothing or about crossdressing or about any of the surface language that the world uses to talk about this kind of life. The something important was about the interior capacity to be alone with yourself, and to not feel that the aloneness was an indictment. The practice had been, in ways I had not understood until that moment, an early education in solitude. My therapist did not say much in response. She nodded, and then she asked me to think about whether there were other ways to cultivate that capacity that did not require the practice, and whether I had been using the practice as a stand-in for something else that I had never tried to find. That question opened something in me that has not closed since. I want to share it because I think it might open something in someone else. I want to tell you about the ways I have found, since that session, to cultivate that capacity without the practice. I read slowly, in long stretches, in the morning, in a chair by the window, with a cup of coffee, with no phone and no music and no agenda. The reading has become a room of its own. I write in longhand, in the morning, in the same journal I have been keeping for years. The writing has become a room. I cook dinners for myself that take a long time with multiple steps and a glass of wine on Sundays while I listen to a podcast about something I do not particularly care about. The cooking has become a room. I take walks for an hour or two on Saturday mornings in a park near where I live with headphones and a list of things I want to think about. The walks have become rooms. These are not the same as the practice. They are not meant to be the same. They are meant to be different practices that serve some of the same purposes, and they do, mostly. There are days when they are not enough, and on those days I am aware, in a way that is not panicked, that there is a deeper thing the practices do not reach, and that the deeper thing is the thing the practice was, and that on those days the practice is available, and that the practice is something I can choose, and that choosing it is different from needing it, and that the difference is the most important thing I have learned. I want to step back out of the specifics of my own life and say something a little more general about the kind of story I have been telling. I have been telling a story that is not a story about transformation. I have been telling a story that is not a story about a person who woke up one day as one thing and went to bed as another. I've been telling a story about a person who has been one thing his entire life, who has always had the same private rooms, who has always had the same quiet curiosity, and who has, over the course of decades, come to a quieter and more honest relationship with the thing that he has always been. Transformation stories are exciting and are easier to sell, but they are also usually not true. Real life does not usually transform. Real life is mostly the slow accumulation of understanding. Real life is mostly the slow disappearance of shame. Real life is mostly the slow discovery that the things you were afraid of are smaller than you thought they were. Real life is mostly the slow discovery that the people you were afraid of are not as afraid of you as you were afraid of them. Real life is mostly the slow discovery that you can be seen by a person you trust without being transformed by the seeing. If you have watched or read this far, I want to say something specific to you about what I have tried to do with this story. I have tried to do a few things at once, and I want to be honest about which ones I think I have done well, and which ones I am less sure about. I think I have done well at describing the interior life of a person who has had the experience I have had, in language that does not flatten the experience into something simpler than it is. I think I have done well at describing the family dynamics that I grew up in without making the family into villains, because my family was not made of villains. I think I have done well at describing the role of shame without treating shame as an enemy, because shame is not an enemy. Shame is a tool that has been used badly, and the tool itself is not the problem. I think I have done well at describing what therapy looked like for me without overstating the role of therapy in my life, because therapy was important, but it was not the only thing that mattered. I am less sure that I have done well at describing what to do. I have tried to be careful with advice. I have tried not to overclaim. I have tried not to tell people what they should do based on the limited experience of one person. If you are looking for advice, you should not read this story looking for advice. You should read this story looking for company, and then you should take the company to whatever resource makes sense for your situation, which might be a therapist, which might be a friend, which might be a journal, which might be a letter to yourself, which might be something else I cannot imagine from where I am sitting. I want to close now. I have written this at length, and deliberately, because I think the length is part of the message. The thing I have been describing cannot be summarized in a single sentence. The thing I have been describing cannot be reduced to a single insight or a single moral or a single recommendation. The thing I have been describing is a slow and ongoing work, and the work has the shape it has because of the time that has been put into it, and a faster telling would not have honored the work. I am sorry if the length has been more than you wanted. I am grateful if the length has been what you needed. I want to close by naming the people who have been part of this story, in case any of them ever read this, and in case naming them is a way of thanking them. My mother, who saw me without saving me. My father, who could not have seen me, who I wish could have. Kara, who I told in a Starbucks and who treated the telling like a thing that had not changed who I was. Lorraine, who I married and who left me when she needed to, with grace. Mark, who heard me without flinching. The therapist who saw me without flinching for almost 2 years. The strangers on the internet who wrote me letters and who I have never met and who taught me that I was not alone. The friend who recommended the therapist who I have thanked many times and who will be thanked many more. The English teacher I had in 10th grade who taught me how to write an honest sentence, which is the only skill I have that has actually mattered. The woman at the bookstore on the corner of my block who told me, when I was in my 20s, that one of the books I was holding was a book I would understand in another 10 years, and who was right and who I think of every time I read it now. There is no neat ending to this kind of story. There is no door that closes at the end of the hallway. There is no final revelation. There is only the next morning, and the next cup of coffee, and the next paragraph in the journal, and the next call with my mother on Sunday, and the next time I take out the slip and hold it for a few minutes and put it back in the wooden box on the top shelf of my closet. There is only the next morning. There is only the slow disappearance of the need for a special section. There is only the slow accumulation of understanding. There is only the slow and patient work of becoming a person who can be seen. Thank you for reading this far. Thank you for the time you have given me. Thank you for not flinching. Thank you for being the kind of person who can sit through a long and quiet story about a complicated interior life and walk away from it a little more able to hold someone else's complicated interior life. That is what the next morning looks like for me too, and the more of us there are who can do that, the fewer of the people in the middle of figuring it out will have to do it alone. I want to talk about the people who love people like me because they have a version of this story that I cannot tell for them, but that I want to honor. The partners of people like me have their own interior life. They have their own rooms. They have their own quiet adjustments they make to fit around the shape of someone who carries a thing they cannot see. I have known 3 serious partners in my life, and I have talked to each of them since about what it was like in their own words, and I want to pass on what they told me because I think it belongs in any honest version of the story. Kara told me, years after we broke up, that the first thing she felt when I told her in that Starbucks was relief. She said she had already known something was being kept from her, not in any specific way, but in the general way that you can tell when someone is performing a version of themselves in a long-term relationship. She said the relief was not because the secret was small, the secret could have been anything, the relief was that the secret had come out. She said she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for the performance to end. The performance was more tiring for her than the truth would be. This is something I carry with me now. The performance is more tiring for the people around us than the truth would be, and most of us in this position continue the performance longer than we need to, partly because we are afraid of the truth, and partly because we do not know that the performance is tiring anyone but ourselves. Lorraine told me, in the careful conversations we had in the year after our separation, that the private practice had never been the problem in our marriage. She said the problem, when she had won, was the silence around it. She said the silence turned her into a person who was guessing, and that guessing was incompatible with the kind of marriage she wanted to be in. She said she did not want to be the spouse who was guessing. She said she wanted to be the spouse who knew. She said that when she finally told me, near the end, that she could not stay married to the silence, she meant exactly that and nothing more, and I have been grateful for the precision of her language ever since. People who love us need to be spared the guessing. People who love us want to know what they are agreeing to. People who love us want to know what they are agreeing to because they are adults, and because love without information is not the kind of love most adults want to be in. Mark told me, when I thanked him for his reaction in the coffee shop, that he had been doing a similar kind of thinking for years about his own mother, who had carried a private grief for decades that nobody in the family had been allowed to name. He said my honesty had made it easier for him to think about his mother's situation, and that he considered the exchange fair. I want to share this because it taught me that telling the truth about yourself does not always land only on you. Sometimes it lands on a person standing nearby. Sometimes the telling gives the listener the right to think about their own unsaid things. Sometimes our honesty is more useful to the people we tell than it is even to us. This is one of the most clarifying things I have learned about disclosure, and I have been moved by it every time it has happened. I want to talk briefly about the people who did not handle my truth well because they are a smaller group than you might fear, but they exist, and their reactions deserve to be named. I have had exactly 3 people in my life respond to disclosure with something worse than silence. One was a man I worked with in my late 20s, who took the disclosure as an opportunity to make a joke in front of other people later, and who I never spoke to again. One was a cousin, who told my mother something I had not authorized to be told, and who I had to spend several months repairing with my mother, and who is no longer a part of my life. One was a woman I dated briefly in my 30s, who took the disclosure as evidence that I was lying about everything, and who could not be talked out of that interpretation. I tell you these 3 not to scare you, but to make sure that the story I have been telling is honest. Disclosure is not always safe. Disclosure is not always met with the reaction Kara had, or Mark had, or Lorraine had. Some people will not be able to hold it. Some people will use it against you. Some people will decide that the disclosure gives them permission to act in ways you did not authorize. These things are real. These things are part of the cost. The cost is worth it in my experience, but it is real. If you are considering telling someone, please consider who they are, and please consider whether the telling serves you, and please consider that you do not owe the telling to anyone. The telling is for you. The telling is not for the other person. The telling is something you do because you want a witness, and a witness is something you have the right to, and a witness is also something you have the right to withhold if you decide that the witness is not safe in the hands you are considering. I want to talk about writing for a moment because this story is written and because the writing has been its own particular kind of work. I have been keeping a journal for almost 15 years. I started the journal in my early 30s on the recommendation of a friend who told me that writing in longhand would help me slow down in the way I needed to slow down. I have been writing in that journal almost every morning since. The journal is not a diary in the conventional sense. It is more like a long conversation with myself, in which I write down the things I have been thinking about, in language that I try to make as honest as I can, and in which I do not hold back the hard parts. Writing has taught me at least 3 things that have mattered to this story. The first is that writing slows down the interior life in a way that makes it easier to look at. The interior life moves at a speed that does not always permit clear sight. Writing forces the interior life to slow down enough that I can see what is actually in it, instead of what I think is in it. The second is that writing makes the interior life shareable in a way that thinking does not. I can write a sentence and read it back and notice immediately whether the sentence is honest. I can think a sentence and have no way of knowing whether the thought is honest. The third is that writing accumulates. The journal from 15 years ago is here on the shelf behind me, and it is full of sentences that I wrote in a state I do not fully remember. And those sentences are now artifacts I can examine, and the examining has taught me more about myself than any single conversation ever has. If you are a person who is in the middle of figuring it out, I want to recommend writing gently without making it sound like medicine. Writing is not medicine. Writing is just a way of holding the interior life steady enough to look at. If you write for 10 minutes in the morning, in longhand, without an agenda, you may find, over the course of months, that the interior life has begun to organize itself in ways you could not have organized it by thinking alone. This has been my experience. I am not promising it will be yours. I am offering it as an option that has worked for me, and that might work for you. The worst that happens if you try it is that you have a notebook full of sentences. The best that happens if you try it is that you begin to understand yourself a little more clearly than you did before. I want to talk about small towns because I grew up in one, and because small towns are a particular kind of environment for people like me, and because small towns have changed in the years I have been alive. The small town I grew up in was not a place where anyone talked about what they were in any language that I would have recognized as relevant. The small town I grew up in was a place where people had categories, and the categories were tight, and the categories added up to a small set of acceptable ways to be a person, and the acceptable ways did not include being a person like me. I am not complaining about this in any moralistic way. I am observing it as a fact of the environment I grew up in. Small towns, in my experience, do not give you language. Small towns give you templates. The templates are useful for some parts of life, and not for others. The templates are especially not useful for the parts of life that require you to invent your own language. I left the small town when I was 18 to go to the state school, I have already mentioned, and I have lived in cities or large towns ever since. I have found cities to be much better environments for the kind of person I am, not because cities are more accepting of people like me, but because cities are more anonymous, and anonymity has its own kind of safety, and that safety made it easier for me to do the slow interior work, the work required. I want to acknowledge that the cities I have lived in have not always been welcoming. I want to acknowledge that I have had difficult experiences in cities. I want to acknowledge that moving from a small town to a city is not a solution to the underlying problem. The underlying problem is the interior work, and the interior work can be done anywhere. I am just noting that it has, in my case, been easier to do in a place where I did not have to look my second cousin in the eye at the grocery store. I want to talk about religion for a moment because religion was a part of the environment I grew up in, and because religion has been a factor in the interior life of many of the people who carry what I carry. The religion I was raised in was a mainstream Protestant denomination, and the church I attended was a modest building a few blocks from my house, and the prayers and the hymns and the sermons have stayed with me in ways I do not always choose. Some of what I learned in that church has been helpful, and some of it has been harmful, and most of it has been both. The helpful part is the part that taught me that there is something in the universe that is larger than the daily self, and that the daily self is not the only self, and that the larger self is worth attending to. The harmful part is the part that taught me that some kinds of being are wrong, and that wrongness is a permanent category, and that a person who is wrong in this way is wrong forever, and that the wrongness cannot be discussed honestly with anyone. I am not religious in the way I was raised to be religious. I am not unreligious either. I am somebody who has figured out how to take the helpful parts of what I was taught and to leave the harmful parts where they were, and to do that without resentment, and that work has been its own kind of work. The work of sorting the helpful from the harmful in a religious inheritance is not unique to people in my position. Lots of people have to do this kind of sorting for lots of reasons. The particular version of the sorting that I have had to do has been colored by the fact that the harmful part of the inheritance was aimed specifically at people like me, and that the harm was not abstract but was a kind of threat, and that the threat kept me quiet for decades. I am no longer quiet. I am not loud either. I am speaking in the moderate voice of a person who has done the sorting, and I am telling you what the sorting looked like from the inside, in case the sorting is something you are doing or might do. I want to talk about age, because age has been one of the most important variables in my own relationship to this story. The story was different at different ages, and I want to mark the changes. At 10, the story was simple. The story was curiosity and a hallway and a piece of fabric. The story did not have words. The story did not have shame. The story did not have any of the things that would come later. The story was just a moment. At 14, the story had grown up into a practice. The practice had shame attached to it now, and the shame was the largest single fact about the practice. The shame was bigger than the practice. The shame was the reason the practice could not be told to anyone. The shame drove the practice underground. The shame required me to build a public self that I did not want to be building. The shame took up most of the energy that should have gone to figuring out who I was. At 20, the story had lost its father, and the loss of the father removed one of the people who needed to be told, and the removal made the story easier to keep in private. The story at 20 was a story that had been told to no one, and that needed to be told to someone, and that I was not brave enough to tell. At 30, the story had become a marriage, and the marriage forced me to tell it, and the telling was successful in some ways and unsuccessful in others, and the marriage ended, and the ending was related to the story in a way I have already described. At 38, the story became a therapy, and the therapy changed the story into something that could be told, and the telling was made possible by a witness who did not flinch, and the witness was what I had needed all along. At 46, now, the story has become the writing you are reading. The writing is the most public version of the story I have ever created, and the writing is also, paradoxically, the most private version because the writing does not identify me in any specific way, and because the writing is the version of the story that I am leaving behind, and because the writing is the version of the story that other people will know even if they never know me. I want to acknowledge that age brings its own kind of acceptance and its own kind of loss. The acceptance is the slow realization that the story is not going away, and the realization is not a defeat. The loss is the slow realization that the story did not get resolved in the way that some people hoped I would resolve it, and that I will not be doing a public transformation, and that I will not be giving a TED Talk about my journey, and that the resolution, if there is one, is the quiet kind, and that the quiet kind is enough. I want to talk about what I have not told you because every first-person story leaves things out, and some of the things I have left out are part of why the story is the shape it is.
I have not told you the name of the small town.
I have not told you what my father's job was in detail. I have not told you the specific kind of lingerie I am describing. I have not told you the names of the people I have referenced in any more specific way than I have used. I have not told you the books I read. I have not told you the specific kind of writing I do professionally. I have done all of this not because the details do not exist, but because the details are not the point of the story. The point of the story is what the story does to a reader, and the details would not improve the doing. I want to acknowledge that leaving things out is a kind of privilege that not everyone has. People who write publicly about interior life in marginalized communities sometimes cannot leave things out, because the public version of the story is a political act, and political acts require specificity. I am not in that position in any obviously political way. I am a person who carries a private thing, and who has decided to talk about it in a moderate voice. My position has costs, and the costs are the kind I have already described, and the costs are not the costs of being publicly political. I want to acknowledge this because the costs of being public about private things are not equal, and the most private kinds of interior life are sometimes carried by the people who can least afford to make them public. I want to offer one more thing before I close. The thing is this. There are people who are going to come to this story with bad faith. There are people who will read it and decide that I am confessing something monstrous. There are people who will read it and decide that I am trying to recruit children. There are people who will read it and decide that I am doing something perverse. There are people who will read it and decide that I am against some political position they hold. There are people who will read it and skip past everything I have said and focus on the sensational language that the video title borrowed, and who will leave comments I do not want to read and that I cannot stop. I want to say in advance that those readings are not what I have written. Those readings are what those readers have brought. I cannot stop those readings. I am not trying to stop those readings. I am only trying to make sure that the writing itself is what I have said it is. If you came to this story through a title that promised something else, I am sorry for the mismatch. The title was borrowed from a long conversation with my mother in her kitchen, and the title captures one specific moment in a long interior life, and the title is not the story. The story is the interior life. The story is the hallway with a piece of fabric, and the silence that grew around the piece of fabric, and the slow disappearance of the silence, and the slow acquisition of language, and the slow process of being seen. If you came for the title, you may want to leave. If you stay, I hope you will read with the generosity that the interior life requires. I want to close with one more true sentence. The true sentence is that I have written the story in a state of as much honesty as I have access to, and that the state of as much honesty as I have access to is the best state I can offer. I am not offering you certainty. I am offering you honest language about an interior life that I have lived for 46 years. You can do what you want with the honest language. You can leave it where it lies. You can take it and pass it on to someone who needs it. You can take it and use it to understand someone you love. You can take it and use it to understand yourself. You can take it and decide that you disagree with it. You can take it and decide that it is wrong about some things. Any of those responses are fine, and any of those responses are part of why the writing is here. The writing is not here to be correct. The writing is here to be true. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.